As the end of my junior year of college approached, I was determined to spend this summer driving around the US, meeting and talking to people, and just having fun. I found out last summer that staying in hotels and Airbnbs got expensive really quickly. I had to abort my grand plans to slink home and get a menial job until school started again. But not this year, not if I could help it. So with the promise of summer alive and trees heavy with foliage, and in the warm spring air that made every classroom a dreary daydream, I decided to get really creative. I wouldn't allow a lack of funds to cut my summer travels short again. So in my desperation, and for the first time in my life, I turned to the dark web. I wanted to see if there was something like a cheaper version of Airbnb out there. And I soon figured out that there were several sites like that on the internet's dark underbelly. As I looked through them, I felt as though I struck a gold mine. Not only could I stay in places much cheaper, but as an aspiring author, I could write a book on the dark web and my travels. Of course, I wasn't dumb enough to think I wouldn't be putting myself in danger, but I wasn't too worried about it. I was confident I could handle myself, and I took some basic precautions to ensure I wasn't getting ripped off. But I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. I wasn't ready for what awaited me. I couldn't handle myself after what I experienced. But before I started my trip, you couldn't have convinced me that something so insane would happen. Not to me. So when school let out early at the end of May, I loaded up my car and hit the road. The first place I booked was creepy as hell. It was a property on the outskirts of a small Appalachian town, and the host was a guy named Reginald. He had several small trailers he was renting out, and I managed to talk him into only taking a partial deposit for my stay there. But when I showed up at the place, after dark, I might add, Reginald was nowhere to be found. I saw the trailers, which were set up in the woods around an old ramshackle ranch house. But when I went up to the house and knocked on the door, there was no answer. The only thing was, I got this weird feeling that the house wasn't really empty. I had a feeling that there was someone in there, and they were waiting to spring out like a cornered animal if I kept snooping around. The entire property was deathly quiet. Chalking up my deposit, which was only $100, to the dark web learning curve, I got back in my car and rushed out of there in a hurry. I slept in my car, cramped and uncomfortable, and afraid my little dark web experiment wasn't going to work. But the next day, I arrived at the second place I booked. This place was going to be a longer stay, 5 days, and it was more of a barter situation than anything else. I booked it for 5 days because it seemed like a legit prospect. Plus, I didn't have to give any money up front, which was a definite plus. As I pulled up to the property, I spotted a gray-haired couple out in the field to the right of a charming white farmhouse. They stopped their work, planting something in the tilled rows of soil, and waved at me. I parked and got out of my car to meet them. The man's name was Gary, and the woman's was Lisa. They seemed wary, but polite. Gary wore a pistol on his hip, and I had no doubt that he knew how to use it. But when it was clear that I wasn't there to do them any harm and genuinely wanted to work for my stay, they warmed up to me. Gary told me that there was no cell service and no internet out here, but I already knew that. It was on his posting. It was a little strange because they weren't that far outside a medium-sized West Virginia town, but it wasn't a big deal. I planned for it, giving my parents the same written directions Gary had sent me just after we struck our agreement over the dark web. After feeding me lunch and showing me the 4-room cabin where I'd be staying near the back of the property, they put me to work. It was only later that night, when they were feeding me dinner, that I asked what had been on my mind all day. "So how come you're on the dark web?" I asked, after swallowing a delicious mouthful of candied yams. "Why go there when you could just as easily post on the regular internet?" Lisa, whose blue eyes were lively in her wrinkled face, looked at her husband. Gary leaned back in his seat, a pained look on his face. "Well, Carter," Gary said, "we tried that before. Many of them were of no use to us because we don't need money. As you know by now, we need someone strong and capable like you to help us out around here in exchange for lodging. So that cut most of the well-known options out right from the get-go. But there were some options. Websites where you could post, looking for farm workers or what they used to call hobos back in my day. But we had a bit of trouble on those sites once. We had a man book through one of them, but when he got here, he tried to rob us, and I had to shoot him. Gary's eyes didn't waver from mine as he spoke, although there was no hint of pride in his voice. If anything, there was remorse. After that, he said, we were blacklisted, unable to use any of the sites anymore. So, as a man who likes to stay apprised of the times, I looked into the dark web. But you didn't get in trouble for shooting the man? I asked. I mean, it was self-defense, right? In the eyes of the law, that's right, Gary said. But in the eyes of the companies who run those websites, we were guilty. I think it was the pressure from the young fella's family. They tried their best to ruin us, and they were the ones to convince the websites to keep us off. You see, keeping this place running is a point of pride for Lisa and me. Well, I'm glad to be here, I said. You have a beautiful place, and I'm happy to work for my stay. Thank you, Carter, Lisa said. We surely do appreciate that, and we appreciate the work you've already done here today. We chatted for another hour or so before I sensed that they wanted their house to themselves again. I excused myself, agreeing to be up early to help out with the chores again, and headed down the narrow trail that ran through the woods, separating their farmhouse from the small cabin I was staying in. As I walked, I thought about my experience last night at Reginald's place. There was something not quite right about that property. I was glad I had listened to my gut and got out of there. And now that I was here and had gotten to know Gary and Lisa a little bit, my instincts told me it would be a pleasant, if exhausting, stay. That was okay. I never minded a little hard work. It was half the fun. Besides, I had more energy than I did money. When the old couple had shown me the cabin earlier, I brought my bags down. They were just where I'd left them. But as I got to exploring the cabin a little more, I started noticing some odd things. Things I hadn't noticed earlier in the swift tour the pair had given me. All the windows and doors seemed to be newer than the rest of the structure. They all had locks that were shiny and thick. The window locks were all engaged. I tried to unlock one, but it was stuck. I couldn't get it to disengage to allow me to open the window. Not that it was cool enough outside to warrant it. Shrugging it off, I turned on the air conditioner and started unpacking. The structure was a simple square with a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a semi-separated sitting area adjacent the kitchen. It was quaint and homey, although it seemed more solidly made from the inside than it did from the outside. I figured they had done some interior renovations, but hadn't yet touched the exterior. Tired from the previous night's poor sleep and the day's work planting corn with the old couple, I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and got into bed. I fell asleep shortly thereafter. But I woke up again as a weight settled on the bed beside me, and I felt the unmistakable heaviness of an arm falling gently across my chest, like a lover shifting position. At first, the impossibility of this confused me, making me think of my ex-girlfriend, Cherie. In my drowsy state, I imagined it was Cherie who was in the bed beside me. But this fantasy was short-lived, as reality pushed its way into my head, alarm bells going off slowly at first, and then with more and more urgency as I blinked in the darkness. Turning my head toward the newly arrived weight on the bed, I brought into view Gary's face. He was lying on his side, his head on my pillow, a sharp, childlike grin on his weathered face as he looked at me. It was his arm that was across my chest, and I realized with mounting horror, he was bare-chested. He had no shirt on. He threw a leg across my thighs, prompting me to look down, seeing that he wore nothing but a pair of yellowed underwear that had once been white. Thinking this some kind of Alzheimer's-fueled mistake, I started to move politely away from him while thinking of something to say to break him from his trance. Then I heard From the opposite side of the room, Lisa's voice. "Bite him," she said in a husky whisper. She flipped on the lights. I whipped my head over to her, seeing that she, too, was only dressed in underwear. She had a tan-colored bra and matching panties, her saggy skin bright under the light from above the bed. She held a phone in one hand, looking at her husband and me hungrily. I knew without seeing the screen that she was recording this sick invasion. In the brief moment before pain became my only concern, I had several rushing thoughts. How did I not sense this? I asked myself. How did I not know? How had my instincts failed me? Gary shifted beside me, his arm clamping across my chest as his warm and mildewy breath invaded my nostrils just before he bit into my nose with unrestrained violence. Blood erupted from my nose. I screamed and bucked, but Gary held me down with his arm and leg, sinewy muscle surprisingly strong for someone his age. Breathing heavily and giggling, Lisa danced at the side of the bed, recording the insanity. I continued to fight, using my height to my advantage as I jerked and writhed to get the old man off me. He was pressed against me, holding my arms down to my sides, but I still fought. Finally, with the terrible pain that threatened to sap all my energy, Gary pulled his head away, spitting the tip of my nose out of his mouth before shouting at his wife. "Get the drugs," he said. "I can't hold him much longer." But he said it in a cheery, unafraid voice. These two knew what they were doing. They'd done this before. Giggling, Lisa scampered over to the dresser and grabbed a syringe, flipping off the orange cap with her thumb. As she came over toward me, I redoubled my efforts. I knew that if they stuck me with that syringe, it was all over. I would be dead, or something far worse. Gary shifted position to hold me down, but in doing so, he momentarily let up on my right arm. I immediately whipped the arm out from under the covers and punched the approaching Lisa in the stomach. She doubled over and dropped the syringe, which fell needle first directly into my right thigh, piercing blanket, sheet, and skin alike. But it wasn't over. The plunger hadn't moved. The drugs were still in the syringe and not in my body. Gary made a move for the syringe to push the plunger down, but for all his strength, I was quicker. I yanked the medical implement out of my thigh and jammed it into Gary's left eye, pressing the plunger down as he screamed and then yanked his head away. But it was too late. The drugs were already in him, and his eye was ruined. I rolled out of the bed, landing hard on my knees. Lisa was right there, and she screamed, dropping the phone to pummel me with her fists. I reached out and grabbed her legs around the backs of the knees. Plowing my shoulder into her midsection, I lifted her up and then slammed her to the floor. Her head struck the well-constructed hardwood floor with a resounding crack. Her eyes swiveled in different directions with the impact, and they stayed that way as she lay there, no longer giggling or dancing or telling her husband to bite me. I grabbed the phone she'd been holding and ran out of the bedroom. I grabbed my keys, wallet, and phone and nothing else. I was still dressed only in my boxer shorts, and I soon realized that my car was nowhere to be found. They moved it. So I did the only thing I could. I ran. I ran until I found that my phone had service, at which point I called the police and waited off in the trees by the side of the road until they showed up. My feet were bleeding, and I was a shaking mess, but I told the sheriff's deputy what had happened. His response surprised me. "I knew it," he said. "I knew it. We've suspected those creepy old farts for a long time, son. A long damn time. You're lucky to be alive. You're one lucky kid." In the end, Gary was charged with 16 counts of murder, the number based on the skeletons they eventually found buried on his property. He was also charged with a laundry list of other violations, mostly having to do with what he and his wife did to me. Lisa wasn't charged with anything. I'd broken her skull when I slammed her into the floor, and she died before the paramedics ever showed up at the cabin. All through the trial, Gary sat there with his eye patch, staring blankly ahead while his public defender tried his best to limit the damage. The prosecutor determined, with plenty of video footage recovered from the scene, that they preferred young men. They would torment them, drug them, and then play with them for a few weeks before eventually growing tired and killing them. I came within inches of that living hell, and it was all because I was cocky and wanted to save some money while I traveled. It was dumb, but I learned my lesson. I haven't been on the dark web since, and I suggest you stay away from it too. You never really know what people are up to or what their intentions are. You never really know. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and smash that like button to get notified every time I upload a new video.